we have our textbook here, Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. And I saw in the chat, David Fox is organizing a study group of our new textbook. He's organizing a study group of it in Australia. So if you want to get involved in that, send me an email and I'll pass your information on to David Fox. My email is just my first name and last name, calebmaupin@gmail.com, calebmaupin@gmail.com. And you can I'll pass it on. And I thought for the remainder of my opening remarks here tonight, I would just read some of the new textbook, right? Because I'm really proud of this thing, honestly, right? This textbook is you will learn so much from this, so much source material from original writers, original people. And I also wrote a very thorough history of the anti-imperialist movement in America. So I'm just going to read it to you. I'm going to start reading chapter 1. And we'll probably read the first few pages of the textbook, which kind of give the overview of what the book is about. So I'm just going to start reading. I'm going to read you the first few pages, and then we'll do the roll call, and then I'll answer people's super chat questions. So if you've got any super chat questions, send them my way. And I'm just going to start reading, from the textbook because I'm really proud of this. This photograph on the cover, March of Vietnam Veterans from 1976. We won't fight another rich man's war. I view that as like the ideal message of an anti-imperialist movement, right? That wars are fought for the bosses and that we need a government that fights for the people and not the wars to serve the profits of the rich. And I talk about that march in here in the chapter on the new communist movement, but I'm just going to start reading to you from the textbook. I'm going to read you the first couple pages. All right. This is chapter 1. William Z. Foster and the Communist Party USA. And I'll just show you the epigraph that we've got here, which is a quote from Mao. Unite all the forces that can be united and build a broad, united front against monopoly capital and against the imperialist policies of aggression and war. See that? Unite all the forces that can be united and build a broad, united front against monopoly capital and against the imperialist policies of war and aggression. All right, so here we go. This is chapter 1. This is part 1, William Z. Foster and the Communist Party. All right. The Communist Party USA was certainly not the first socialist organization in American history. The organization struggled to establish itself in the early 1920s, and it peaked in its power and influence during the late 1930s. The organization faced heavy repression and persecution after the Second World War, but maintained a layer of loyal members who were capable of impacting American politics. The organization ultimately stopped being a force to be reckoned with in the late 1950s, with the 1957 convention more or less ending its political significance. What made the Communist Party USA important was it was the first anti-imperialist organization to take hold in the country. There were certainly anti-war organizations, such as Mark Twain's Anti-Imperialist League. There had been pacifists and socialists like Eugene Debs who opposed the war on a class basis. But the Communist Party USA was founded on the ideological breakthroughs of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and specifically the teachings of Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin significantly updated the teachings of Karl Marx. Marx had rejected all nationalism, saying, "Workers of the world, unite." Marx believed that because European capitalism was the most advanced and developed, the working class revolution would take place in Europe. Marx envisioned a revolution of industrial workers taking control of the government and using state power to centralize production and institute popular control of industries. Lenin understood that starting in the late 1800s, capitalism had moved toward its monopolistic stage of imperialism. Financial institutions were becoming dominant, with industries subservient to them, and an international financial oligarchy emerged to replace the captains of industry, who had previously had the upper hand. Instead of exporting commodities, The Western countries were engaged in the export of capital, with the corporations themselves spreading their tentacles across the planet, holding back development and carving out spheres of influence, sections of the planet for themselves as sources of raw material. This was all explained in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in 1916 and published the following year. In the era of imperialism, many working class people in the Western countries were being bought off. A layer of higher paid skilled workers was cultivated in the homeland, the aristocracy of labor. Their loyalty to empire was purchased with temporary privileges. Meanwhile, the revolutionary energy was shifting to the colonized world, where entire nations were fighting to be free from the economic domination of the Western colonizers. In the colonized world, the working class could position itself at the center of struggles for national liberation to free entire countries from the domination of the global system of imperialism. The revolutionary energy was shifting from the West to the East. Lenin argued that imperialism was causing a split in the global socialist movement. Many of the socialist and Marxist parties were dominated by the labor aristocrats who benefited from imperialism. And as a result, their revolutionary edge was slipping away. The way the various parties ended up sending workers off to die in the First World War was confirmation to Lenin that the socialist movement of the West was no longer revolutionary. Lenin said it was necessary to break with these organizations dominated by the high-paid skilled workers who benefited from imperialist crumbs, and instead go lower and deeper to the real masses of more impoverished workers to build a genuinely revolutionary organization. After Lenin's death, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin coined the term Marxism-Leninism to describe the ideology of the Communist International, a network of political parties around the world that followed Lenin's teachings about building a movement against imperialism. Marxism-Leninism is an ideology centered around defeating imperialism and mobilizing struggles for national liberation led by the working class to break countries free and enable them to industrialize with a planned socialist economy. The ultimate goal is to eventually move all of humanity toward a state of vast abundance so that all poverty, inequality, and the need for a state itself can fade away. This vision of a world free from scarcity and the need for coercion is called the higher stage of communism. With the understanding that defeating imperialism was the focus, shortly after taking power, the Bolsheviks convened the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku to unify all who were fighting against the Western colonial powers. Lenin offered military support to the Emir of Afghanistan, a very traditionalist and right-wing monarch who was battling the British for control of his homeland. Stalin explained the struggle that the Emir of Afghanistan is waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates, for it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism. The Communist International recognized that within the imperialist countries there were colonized peoples and territories. The Communist International argued that the Black Belt region of the U.S. South, where African Americans were concentrated, was a colonized territory within U.S. borders, as the wealth created by the crops of the highly fertile soil was extracted to make profits for big corporations, and the black people of this rural region lived in extreme poverty. The Communist International argued that black people in the United States, the descendants of slaves, were an oppressed nation because they were segregated from U.S. society and paid much lower wages than white workers. On that basis, the Communist International called for self-determination for the Black Belt, arguing that Black people should have the right to establish a separate country in the Black Belt region of the South. Though the Soviet Union is gone, and the majority of the forces around the world opposing the imperialists have more or less strayed from standard Marxist-Leninist thinking, the nature of imperialism and anti-imperialism has not changed. Imperialism, the system Lenin accurately described as decadent, moribund capitalism, is still the prevailing system in the world. The primary contradiction in the world today is the struggle between this system and the forces fighting to liberate the world from it. Marxism-Leninism laid the basis for Russia and China industrializing, for the Cuban Revolution, for the wave of national liberation struggles that laid the ground for the emerging alternative economy in the world today. The BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Bolivarian Alternative of Latin America, the Axis of Resistance in the Middle East, all exist because of the breakthroughs in the struggle against imperialism, which began with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, the primary ideology of the forces battling against imperialism was Marxism-Leninism. And all the other schools of anti-imperialist thought, such as Bolivarianism and Baathism, are heavily influenced by Marxism-Leninism and its legacy. These forces all identify the system of imperialism, as Lenin understood it, as their enemy on the global stage. Marxism-Leninism laid the foundation on which the new world is emerging and on which the modern anti-imperialist forces have all emerged. The Center for Political Innovation is an anti-imperialist organization that believes the future of the American working class lies in defeating imperialism. We believe the working class of the United States should align with the nations of the world struggling against imperialism and create a bloc here within U.S. borders that aims to break the country out of the imperialist system. We believe a new America can be created with a government of action that fights for working families. Such a government, brought to power by a mass movement of the people, could break the power of the big banks and monopolies and restructure U.S. society to be one where the economy flourishes in alliance with the new global order centered around Russia and China and the anti-imperialist states. The working class has the most to gain from such a struggle, but it must sit at the center of an anti-monopoly coalition of all the forces that want prosperity and reject the schemes of the imperialists to save the dying system with war and a low-wage police state. With this understanding, the history of the Communist Party is extremely important for us to study. The Communist Party USA was the first anti-imperialist organization in American history. It was the first organization based on this understanding of the world. The understanding that imperialism and the struggle against imperialism is the defining question of our epoch. The Communist Party was highly successful and had millions of members, millions of people in the United States. The Communist Party was highly successful and had the support of millions of people in the United States during the late 1930s, when it organized industrial unions, fought for racial equality, and opposed fascism. The person whose leadership more or less defined the Communist Party USA from its inception to its collapse into irrelevance was William Z. Foster. And that is how the first chapter of the book begins. That's the introduction to the first chapter. And from there, I tell the story of the life of William Z. Foster, the founding and establishment of the Communist Party. I talk about his organizing of steel workers and meat packers. I talk about McCarthyism, the Great Steel Strike, the unemployment councils that they built. I talk about a lot of very important struggles, his presidential campaigns, right? Election campaign poster, equal rights for Black people. I talk about all of this. This is the first chapter, right? That's the first chapter of the book, and I go over the whole history of the Communist Party, the labor movement, and labor organizing, and all kinds of very important things. I have accounts of pitched battles, and I talk about the Civil Rights Congress, how the Communist Party organized Black people to fight for their rights against Jim Crow segregation. I talk about the Khrushchev secret speech and how the FBI infiltrated the Communist Party and took control. I quote Nelson Peary and his very important work describing how the Communist Party was seized by the FBI. There's a picture of Nelson Peary. I quote his work extensively, talking about the FBI taking control of the Communist Party. And that's the first chapter of the book, right? And this is actually the top FBI informant in the Communist Party, Morris Childs. He actually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan for infiltrating the Communist Party. And I talk about William Z. Foster. His last act was to yell at Khrushchev. Khrushchev came to visit him in his hospital bed, and he confronted Khrushchev. And from his hospital bed, he gave a speech honoring Mao and the Chinese Revolution. That's Khrushchev visiting William Z. Foster just a few months before he died. So William Z. Foster was this very, very important anti-imperialist leader. Now, after I talk about the Communist Party, then I have a number of original texts. I have the great anti-war speech of Eugene Debs, the full text of the speech that Eugene Debs was sent to federal prison for giving, the anti-war speech from Canton, Ohio. One of the most poetic and beautiful speeches that has ever been written. I mean, Lee Stranahan, who's not a communist or a socialist, a conservative, was deeply moved by this speech. And then from there, I have a campaign speech that William Z. Foster gave during the Great Depression for a united struggle against starvation, right? And this is a campaign speech he gave about the fight of the unemployed. It's very powerful, the fight for economic relief. The Communist Party was leading. And then I have the story of Mr. Grossip from Labor's Untold Story, right? About a man who was a conservative, who was an anti-communist, but then he lost his job and he had no choice but to join the unemployment councils. Very powerful story of Mr. Grossip. And from there, we have the story of Jim. And this is Angelo Herndon, a Black communist organizer in the South, recruited a racist white worker to change their views and join the unemployed struggles and join the Communist Party. And I have this story that, from Angelo Herndon about his effort and how he won white workers away from racism by unifying them. And then I have the text of a pamphlet by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn called Meet the Communists. And it's Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's pamphlet that she wrote after World War II, talking about why the communists were the anti-fascists and what the Communist Party stood for, etc. So that's just the first chapter, right? That first chapter will tell you so much about the Communist Party. And then from there, the next section, part 2, is on Sam Marcy and the global class war tendency. And I've got a whole chapter about Sam Marcy and about how he was born in Tsarist Russia, and he faced, violence at the hands of anti-Semites, how his family moved to the United States. He was in the Communist Party. And then I talk about he joined the Trotskyites. And why did he join the Trotskyites? I talk about the evils of Trotskyism, why Trotskyism is bad. But I also talk about why some of the flaws of the Communist Party made the Trotskyites very attractive. And he was a leader of the Young Communist League of Brooklyn. I have some Young Communist League posters there. And I talk about the history of Trotskyism and Stalin and what was behind the Stalin-Trotsky split. I mean, I have a section here called Stalin's Continental Shift, and I talk about how the Communist Party, after Trotskyism was repudiated, they moved their headquarters from New York City to Chicago, and how it was really about Atlanticism versus Eurasianism, and how there was a geopolitical difference underlying the division between Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky was a sea-based socialist. He was a global socialist, a globalist, whereas Stalin was a land-based socialist. He was a Eurasianist or a continental socialist, right? And this is what we can look on, that the communist bloc of the world was very much an expression of the peoples of the land or the civilizations of the land, China, Russia, etc. Whereas Western capitalism is very much an expression, imperialism is very much an expression of the empires of the sea. And Trotskyism was an attempt to integrate Marxism with the empires of the sea, right? And with globalism and with the free trade system, right? And that gradually, Karl Marx was like that too, right? Karl Marx studied in the British Museum, but Marxism gradually left Europe and became an expression of the Eastern civilizations of the land, the Eurasians, right? I talk about the geopolitical roots of the Stalin-Trotsky divide. That's analysis you're not going to find anywhere else. I have cartoons from the Daily Worker making fun of Trotskyism, right? And some original cartoons that mock Trotskyism that I think are really important. I talk about the neocons and how the neoconservatives originated as the New York City clique of Trotskyists. I talk about Irving Kristol and how Sam Marcy was persecuted by the neocons because the neocons were Trotskyites who were so anti-Soviet. And I talk about the fights within Trotskyism that came after World War II. And then I talk about the origins of Sam Marcy, right? This is, Sam Marcy. And then I talk about the Mothers Alliance that he formed in Buffalo, New York, to organize Black women to fight for the rights of their children, to support the civil rights movement. And I talk about how the Buffalo wing of the Communist Party operated, and I talk about all of that, eventually leading to the founding of the Workers' World Party. And I talk about their youth group that they formed, Youth Against War and Fascism. Right, we have them here on Wall Street. Big firms get rich, GIs die. I talk about a lot of different activities they did. Stop the war against Black America, the American Servicemen's Union of Andy Stapp, how they organized GIs to refuse to fight in Vietnam, and they did huge amounts of anti-war outreach to military bases. And I talk about that. I talk about how they dealt with the fact that the political crisis of the 1960s was falling and deteriorating. The Face to the Masses effort, which was like an attempt to go in like an economist direction after the political crisis of the 60s. And I talk about the origin of the movementism, right, that they took on, how they became more and more liberal over the years. In 1984, they endorsed Jesse Jackson, the Democrat, for president, and they were a big part of the Jesse Jackson campaign. And how the group started really deteriorating in the 90s, how they were not prepared for the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union took them by surprise, and they didn't know what to make of it. And the group was really deteriorating into just kind of a liberal protest machine. I talk about that, and then I talk about the origins of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is the main woke communist group in the United States, the liberal anti-working class communist party run by Brian Becker, who is one of Marcy's lieutenants, who ran anti-war rallies for Sam Marcy. Now runs this evil organization called PSL. That is really dedicated to smearing and inciting violence against anti-imperialists and trying to keep, people that are attracted to supporting anti-imperialist causes attached to the woke wing of the Democratic Party that is more pro-war than the Republicans are. I talk about all of that, right? And I talk about like the deterioration of Marxism. And then from there, right, I have original text in this chapter. I've got The Danger of Trotskyism by Moishe Olgin, a very, very important text. By a leader of the Communist Party about why Trotskyism is wrong. Very great essay. I have Mao's statement, which he gave supporting the civil rights movement in America, oppose racial discrimination by U.S. imperialism, which the Workers' World Party distributed 20,000 copies of at the I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King. I have a speech by Bill Epton, who was a leader of the Progressive Labor Party, who was jailed for putting up posters about police brutality. And they charged him with criminal anarchy. And he went to prison for a year for putting up posters about police brutality. And it's this eloquent speech he gave to the court when he was convicted in New York for his free speech, Reminds you of the Uhuru case now, where they're declaring free speech to somehow be a crime and trying to throw people in prison for it. I have Sam Marcy's speech to the Socialist Scholars Conference that he gave in 1990 as all the communist governments were collapsing. He goes to this kind of conference of all these Trotskyite liberal academics and basically says to them, look, it's one thing to be against Stalinism, but the fall of the Soviet Union is going to hurt working class people. I also included a very poetic letter that Sam Marcy wrote to the workers of Louisiana, urging them not to vote for David Duke when David Duke was running for governor of Louisiana. And the argument he makes where he talks about how affirmative action should never hurt white workers and all of that. So that is chapter 2. Again, huge amount in this textbook. This textbook is massive. There's 5 sections. I've only shown you the first 2. The first 2 could be books of their own, right? Section 3, we've got the new communist movement of the 1970s. And I go over that whole history. I talk about the New Left and the civil rights movement and the free speech movement at Berkeley and the Black Panthers. And then from there, I talk about, the Weather Underground and the Weathermen and how the Weathermen were rejected. There was what was called Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 that rejected the Weathermen. This is the picture of the Weathermen and their left adventurous terrorism that they engaged in, the Days of Rage. And then I have Fred Hampton, the leader. This is Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panthers of Chicago, having a press conference along with Mike Klonsky and other Maoist communists denouncing the Weather Underground. I talk about all of that, right? I talk about the various new communist groups that sprung up throughout the United States that took inspiration from China and wanted to form a new communist party that was aligned with China. I talk the October League, was one of those groups. I talk about Amiri Baraka formed his own communist organization, the Revolutionary Communist League of Struggle. I talk about Amiri Baraka and his organization. And then I go over the politics of China that were changing at the time and the rise and fall of Lin Biao, who was like Mao's right-hand man, and how the Cultural Revolution had 2 different phases, and how China started aligning with the United States and its foreign policy. I talk about Wildcat Summer in Detroit. In the workers of Detroit, 1973, you had a wave of communist-led wildcat strikes in Detroit, where workers in Detroit were taking action on the job, led by communists. It's a forgotten chapter in American history. They elected a Maoist communist judge, Justin Ravitz, who had Mao's little red book on the stand. I talk about that. And I talk about a lot of different aspects of this. I talk about the different groups and how they disagreed, the Boston busing riot, and how the Weather Underground, the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee, they tried to steer the communist movement in an identity politics direction. There's this guy Clayton Van Lydegraf, a very bizarre figure with intelligence connections, who was kind of running the Weather Underground, and how they deteriorated over the course of the 70s. And then I talk about the bicentennial and how the Revolutionary Communist Party had this amazing rally. We've carried the rich for 200 years. Let's get them off our backs, right? That's the cover photo. We won't fight another rich man's war. The Revolutionary Communist Party was kind of hated because they had a mass approach. They were going out of the movement to the masses, trying to win over people. How they built up support in the West Virginia coal fields among the coal miners. And then I talk about the decline of everything, and I talk about the role of the Cult Awareness Network, and I talk about San Francisco and how San Francisco's politics were clearly like some kind of bizarre CIA experiments with MK Ultra and Reverend Jim Jones and all of that. And I talk about the, how, as like the late Carter years, like the last years of Carter's presidency, how the communist groups kind of went crazy. They had the Death to Deng Xiaoping rally after they broke with China. That's the RCP. And then I talk about the Greensboro massacre of 1979. And I talk about so many different things. And then I talk about DSA and where Democratic Socialists of America came from, and how DSA was more or less an operation to deprogram communists. That's Michael Harrington, the founder of DSA. And it was kind of an effort to bring people from the Maoist New Communist movement into the Democratic Party. I talk about the Communist Workers' Party, how it deteriorated. And and all of that. And that's the third chapter, right? And then I've got some original text, Crisis of Petty Bourgeois Radicalism by Gus Hall. That was his critique of Students for a Democratic Society and the New Left. That was Gus Hall's criticism. I have this leaflet from the Revolutionary Youth Movement to Why We Carry the NLF Flag, explaining why they as Americans carry the flag of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. I have a report of the Weathermen and their war council that they had, and how they, there was opposition to their anti-working class line. I have a very important speech given by Bob Avakian when the RCP was founded, called "Our Class Will Free Itself and All Mankind." It's like the founding of the RCP speech that Bob Avakian gave in 1975. Very powerful speech about class struggle, etc. I have the history of USSR-China relations by Vince Copeland, talking about the Sino-Soviet split and why the two major communist countries in the world, the Soviet Union and China, stopped being allies, and what broke them apart. Where did that division come from? I have that as well. So this is a lot, right? This is a lot. And that is section 3. And then part 4, divisions in the ruling class. And in part 4, divisions in the ruling class, I talk about McCarthyism, right? And the 3 stages of McCarthyism. People think McCarthyism was all one thing. It was actually 3 distinct stages. First, it was the Democrats purging the Roosevelt wing and purging the pro-Soviet wing. Then from there, it became the Republicans attacking the Democrats and accusing the Democrats of being soft on communism. And then from there, it became a middle-class uprising against the ultra-rich in the name of anti-communism. And at that point, it was crushed. And I talk about how Israel was key in crushing McCarthyism, which nobody talks about. There's Joe McCarthy, right? Joe McCarthy was basically exposed as being a gay sexual predator by Israel. And how, McCarthyism, there was a tone of anti-Semitism underneath it, and that Israeli intelligence was involved in opposing McCarthyism, and the liberals were more pro-Israel back in these days, right? This is Hank Greenspun, the guy who brought down Joe McCarthy, the newspaper editor, who was a Mossad agent, who stole millions of dollars and was actually convicted of stealing millions of dollars worth of military hardware from the U.S. government. I talk about the John Birch Society and how this is a far-right organization that was demonized in American media as extremists that worked against Kennedy, that worked against Lyndon Johnson, and how they thought the ultra-rich were communists, but really they were opposing degrowth, and how the liberal bourgeoisie, the liberals, think tanks like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller think tanks funded by the Rockefellers that were aligned with the CIA, promoting modern art, etc. These think tanks were promoting and reinventing leftism and actual Marxist politics. It's pro-growth, anti-imperialist, populist, working class solidarity was being replaced by this kind of, postmodern pessimism that was from the ultra-rich, and it was used by the ultra-rich to suppress the lower-level capitalists that were in the John Birch Society, etc. And I talk about all of that, right? And I talk about Carroll Quigley and his analysis of the divisions in the ruling class. I talk about Brzezinski and Kissinger and where they came from, the Rockefeller think tanks. And I talk about how there was the rise of the neocons and the manipulation of the communist parties of Europe, the rise of the Euro communists. And I talk about the evangelical Christian movement and the neoconservatives. And then I have a section called The Case of Lynn Marcus, where I talk about Lyndon LaRouche. Who was Lyndon LaRouche, and why would we even pay attention to this guy? Former Trotskyite who became kind of a weird conspiracy activist or whatever, but he actually had an analysis of understanding why the left was embracing degrowth and why economic growth was the key issue of division between the rich and the ultra rich, and why, despite the fact that I disagree with LaRouche on a number of things, LaRouche actually was kind of a pioneering thinker who was very, very important. And I talk about Lynn Marcus and the role that the National Caucus of Labor Committees, this weird formerly Trotskyist group that now is one of the biggest supporters of China and Russia, where did they come from, and why did they play the role that they played? Why did they support Ronald Reagan? right? Ronald Reagan is this vicious anti-communist, but they supported him because they kind of understood. They had an analysis of the divisions within the ruling class. And I talk about the LaRouche movement. I talk about the computer revolution and how Silicon Valley came into existence and the divisions in the ruling class around that. Marilyn Ferguson, the advisor to Al Gore, and the role of kind of the California wing of the CIA and their connections with the computer revolution. And then from there, I talk about the economic crisis that we're currently in, and the roots of it in the built-in problems of capitalism, technology, creating economic crisis, and how ultimately we need to build the pro-humanity, pro-growth coalition. And I talk about the Communist Party. When they started out in the 1950s, right after World War II, William Z. Foster wrote how they wanted to build an anti-monopoly coalition and how basically we're trying to build the same thing in a new playing field, but it's gotten confusing because the liberals are now the foot soldiers of monopoly. And so it's much more complicated, and we're in like a new ballpark. And I talk about the struggle to build an anti-monopoly coalition and what that looks like, right? And I talk about, the synthetic left, how there's 3 stages of the synthetic left. The first stage of the synthetic left was the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom and reinventing leftist politics with the foundations. The second stage was the color revolution apparatus, the manipulation of the communist countries with the cultural leftism, et cetera. And then the third stage is when the color revolution folks came home to help to be the foot soldiers of Obama to try and stabilize U.S. society amid the economic crisis and the meltdown. And I talk about wokeism being like the third stage of the synthetic left. And I talk about, there's a crowd of woke people, and I talk about all of that, and I document all of that, and I quote all of what I'm talking about, and how we as CPI, we're cutting new ground because we have this understanding of the real divisions in the ruling class. So then I've got an important text by Rosa Luxemburg called Socialism or Barbarism, where she talks about how Western civilization, imperialism, will ultimately lead to something like the fall of the Roman Empire, which was a catastrophe for Europe. I talk Sam Marcy's analysis of the new military threat and the divisions in the ruling class around Jimmy Carter, and the rise of Reagan. I have an article from when Lyndon LaRouche was a communist, when he was still calling himself a communist, when he was a Trotskyite, a very important article he wrote called Automation, the New Industrial Revolution, talking about the role of the military in advancing technology and how that leads to capitalist crisis. A very good article that was published in 1955, back when Lyndon LaRouche was still calling himself a communist. And then I have the timeline of 1978 to 1981. So you can see how 1978 to 1981, there was this active war going on in the ruling class, that kind of, escalated and really kind of ended in the first years of Reagan's presidency. And that's chapter 4. And then we've got chapter 5, which is the city building tendency. And it's the history of CPI. But I start out by talking about what can we learn from all of this and how we have to avoid orthodoxy, right? That basically we're not looking for the pure lineage of communism. We don't claim that if Karl Marx was alive today, he'd be in our group, right? And that treating politics like religion, and you want to have the one pure line leading all the way up to you from Karl Marx. We are the true inheritors. That is not correct. And that's very dangerous. And that's weakened communist groups in the United States and around the world. The anti-imperialist countries, China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, they don't have that issue. They are anti-imperialist. They want to build up their countries, but they're much more pragmatic. They'll take and learn from anybody. And we got to get out of the orthodoxy of trying to claim that we are the true inheritors of some communist dynasty. We got to get out of that, right? We have to oppose that. And then I talk about U.S. society and where we're at and what imperialism has done to the minds of working people and the imperialist mindset and Rudyard Kipling and all of that. And I talk about Jessica Lynch, and I talk about, about the confusion of the white working class and racism and such. And then I talk about patriotic socialism and how, it's just common sense. The Communist Party back in the day was very patriotic. Communists in every country in the world where communists have ever come to power, socialists, anti-imperialists, they're always ultra patriotic, right? And how we were attacked for being patriotic socialists, but that shows like how demented the communist groups are. Lenin was patriotic to the Russian Empire, even though he called it a prison house of nations. He was still patriotic to it. I talk about Anna Louise Strong, the American pro-communist journalist who was a Protestant Christian, and the spirituality that kind of flows through her work, and how her socialism is very much rooted in American optimism and American pro-growth sentiments. And if you read Anna Louise Strong's writings, she was part of like the kind of populist, abolitionist Protestant left. And she ended up being a very close friend of Mao and Zhou Enlai and such. And I talk about that, and I talk about the American Revolution and our roots in the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell, and how, very much the United States is like Cromwellian, right? We are basically, as the English Civil War and as capitalism was stabilizing in Britain, all the radical Protestants got exported to the United States. Horace Greeley, right? This is Karl Marx's employer, the Christian socialist Horace Greeley, who was the newspaper owner in New York City, owned the New York Tribune, right? And I mean, he was very much he was the only man who ever hired Karl Marx. I talk about psychoanalysis and how the Khrushchev revelations and the liberalism is really about trying to suppress parental transference and up libidinal release, and the psychoanalysis of how they're messing up young people psychologically. In Europe, icons are very important. But Jerry Rubin, the founder of the New Left, he would shout, "Kill your parents," right? And that there's a psychoanalytic side to all of this. I talk about all of that and how we have to understand how they're trying to manipulate people psychologically in order to implement degrowth and prevent some kind of social revolution. And then from there, I talk about the origins of CPI. I talk about the anti-Iraq war movement, the different factions that existed there. And I talk about the Libyan war and Gaddafi and what we learned from that, and Occupy Wall Street, what we learned from Occupy Wall Street. And I talk about my experience in the Workers' World Party, and I talk about the founding of CPI, how we emerged, how our project matured, and our different strategy, top and bottom organizing, and optimism, and all of that. And that is chapter 5. And then I have a number of foundational materials. I have an internal document that I wrote in the Workers' World Party, urging them to organize differently. And I don't even necessarily agree with everything I wrote in that document, but it shows you that I've been thinking about how to build a real mass anti-imperialist movement for some time. I have basically a document I wrote summing up my experience in the Workers' World Party that I've never publicly released before, that I wrote about a year after I left the party, explaining how my political differences emerged and what really happened. Right? I have the introduction to the Green Book, and the analysis of Gaddafi and Islamic socialism and what we can learn from it. I talk about that. And then I have the Paris Declaration of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, this new regroupment of communist parties that support Russia and China around the world, that's led by the People's Democracy Party of South Korea. That's very important. I have their very important document. And then I have Elizabeth Young, the president of CPI. I have her speech that she gave at the World Anti-Imperialist Platform Congress in Athens, Greece. That's what's in this book. This book has so much in it, right? This book has more than any college textbook you've ever read, right? And this book only costs $34.99. If this was for a college class you were taking, it would probably cost over $200. Right? But we put this out there because we want people to read this. This book has everything you need to know about anti-imperialism, about the brilliant analysis. This book costs $34.99. It is 520 pages, but they're huge pages. It's a huge book that it's got so many original texts. You will learn so much from it. So I just wanted to talk about that. We need in America right now a mass anti-imperialist movement. That is what we need. And this book is written about how we can do it. And this is the first textbook we published. We Are City Builders. This is the second one. And these are our 2 textbooks that we have published so people can have study groups, people can learn about our ideology, learn about anti-imperialism. That is what we've got.